Welcome everyone to our webinar today with AbleNet. Today we're going to be talking about why is the student having difficulty with direct access. So perhaps you're working with a student who's directly accessing some form of assistive technology, whether it be a speech generating device or other technology, but they're struggling with this task. We're going to dig in and do some problem solving of why that might be and what we can do about it. I'm Michele Lange. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area, and I've been working in assistive technology for a long time. And I work quite a bit with wheelchair seating and mobility as well as access to assistive technology. So again, that's what we're going to be talking about today, specifically with those clients that are having difficulty with direct access. Now, I want to make sure I meet your goals here today. So if you have a specific goal, something you want to make sure this webinar touches on today, if you can type that into the chat box, that would be great, and we'll try to touch on those. Also, in terms of questions, feel free to put questions or comments at any time in the chat box. If I don't answer it right away, it's because I am waiting for a good pause or I know that information is coming up. But always appreciate this group, lots of good dialogue, and we really learn from each other that way. All right, so this is what we'll be covering here today. Let's say you're working with a student who's using direct access to control a speech generating device, but they're struggling. How do we determine if the issue is motor-based or if there's another cause? Because it could be another issue. If the client's struggling due to those motor skills, what can we do to optimize their access? And how do we decide at what point we abandon direct access and maybe move to a different access method? And again, feel free to type those goals into the chat box. If we don't have any, that's fine. That means we're starting with those nice low expectations. I saw someone raise their hand real quick. If you, we can't hear you, but if you can type any concerns into the chat box, that'd be great. All right, so what is direct access? Well, direct access is where somebody directly reaches out with a finger or other pointer to a location on a speech generating device display. Some of this also applies to other directly accessed technologies as well. In this case, this smartphone may act as someone's communication device or control of things in the environment. Direct access requires accuracy. The client needs to accurately get to an individual location on their device, not touching the locations around it. That generally requires finger isolation if the client is not using some type of pointer. That can be hard for some of our clients. Some of our clients can get a hand over a specific location, but they may not be able to free up that finger or thumb. They need enough accuracy for the required amount of vocabulary. We don't want to limit someone's vocabulary because they can only press several large locations on a device, for example. The client needs sufficient activation pressure to make the selection. On many of these devices, that's not very much, but there is some degree of pressure that's required, so the client needs to have that, and they need to release when they're done with their selection. Release may not sound very difficult, but some of our clients, when they reach out and touch their device, have difficulty with release because they end up stabilizing against the device. They're trying to find actually some postural support against that device. And to release means they have to maybe move their whole body back instead of simply moving a hand back. And then finally, vision. To directly access a device, the client needs to be able to see their target and discriminate that target from those around it. And that can be challenging for some of our clients as well. So how do we know if a student is having a hard time with direct access? Well, primarily by efficiency. When it comes to directly accessing a speech-generating device, efficiency is a combination of time, how long does it take me to make my selections, effort, how hard is it for me to put together those selections, and accuracy. Because if I keep hitting the wrong selection and have to go back and correct myself, that's also inefficient. So we have this combination of time, effort, and accuracy. We're going to watch a video to give you an example of this young man here, Eric. And you can see that Eric, although he is accurate, is taking a lot of time and a lot of effort to make his selections, and so is not showing us that good efficiency.
Hey, Eric, so tell Michele some things about yourself.
There's a big arm movement and it's bumping the joystick.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
We're just commenting.
Yeah. And if the joystick's forward, still doesn't help too much because sometimes the Dynavox bumps the joystick. And there's not a great place to put an arm support.
So in this video, I'm seeing Eric with a speech therapist that I work with quite frequently, Jill Coleman.
Lots of movement. Okay.
And we're just observing his current
You want some more? Oh yeah, let's get a phrase and we'll put in the joystick.
He's visually scanning his choices. He reaches out and his tone quickly pulls his hand away from his target. And he has to reset. Putting together a sentence for us. And there's taking him a while to put together a sentence. This is part of the problem with inefficiency, is your communication partner might walk away from it.
Your hands on. Those toes too.
He's almost there. He's almost ready to share a very complex sentence with us.
I like go to play.
You love going to plays, don't you?
So he says he likes to go to plays. So that took him a very long time. It took him nearly 3 minutes to type, I like to go to plays. Now, part of this had to do with the way his vocabulary was organized, and we changed that up to try to make him more efficient. But part of it was just how much time and effort it was taking him, although he's fairly accurate with direct access. And we'll revisit Eric again in a little bit to see what we ended up recommending. The struggle is real. Is it motor? Or is it something else? If it's not motor that is keeping someone from that level of efficiency, then it could also be motivation, understanding, or vision. First is motivation. Now you'd think that communication would be plenty motivating, but the client may not have that buy-in yet. Many of our clients think they're communicating already, and they are, maybe through other vocalizations, maybe through yelling, maybe through crying, various ways of letting their needs be met. And often the family has a pretty good idea of what they need. So it might be difficult to convince the client that they now have to put in all this work to learn how to communicate in a different way. Some of our clients might see this as something you're making me do during therapy and not as communication. So it's important that we work with the client to convince them this is not just a therapeutic task, this is communication. You can boss me around, you can let me know what you need. Engaging vocabulary is super important, and this varies with each client. This is Allie. She's motivated by all things social. She could care less about jokes. She doesn't want to tell you her name and how old she is and where she lives and where she goes to her day program. She just wants to socialize. And so that's what her vocabulary is, and that's what motivates her to keep using that communication device. Understanding is another big one. The client has to understand that activating a location on that speech generating device is actually communication. And that takes a lot of reinforcement, especially early on. So the client selects something like, I want to read a book, and boy, you better have a really cool book ready to read now. And that way they know that every time they say something, they make a selection, that they have that immediate reinforcement to reinforce you are communicating. It also depends on the communication strategy. So the client may need to read locations like on this picture here, or understand what a symbol or icon represents. That also can take time. Our very youngest clients are developing language while they're learning how to use a speech generating device. So it's important to slowly build up vocabulary so that the client knows what everything on that device is and how to use it and how to start combining things together. If they do not, they will most likely fail at the task. And someone might come to you and say, well, I guess they can't use direct access. It might be that direct access is too difficult for this client, but it may be that perhaps some baby steps have been skipped and someone's progressed this client faster than they're able to learn the various vocabulary on here. So it's just a learning curve. And then finally, vision. Vision's a huge one. The client needs to be able to see the display. They need to be able to discriminate what a word or symbol is so that they know this is what I want to say. They need to be able to discriminate it from those icons or words around it. And the client needs to be able to track or scan their vocabulary to make a selection. So the client has to look at all their choices before they decide, oh, I want that one. Some of our clients don't have great visual tracking or might have difficulty discriminating this circular stop sign from maybe this kind of red big shape up here above it. So it's important that the client has the visual skills to use direct selection. If motor skills are impacting direct access and getting in the way, there are some strategies we could use to improve that access for the client. First is positioning the client. Very, very important. If the client is not positioned well, they're not going to be able to use their body to access their device well. This again is Allie. Well, when I first met Allie, she was positioned like you see here on the left. It's not a great position. She's hanging on this vest. There's a huge distance between her back and the back of the seating system, and it was affecting her ability to see and to control her communication device. Over here on the right, once we made some changes to her seating, we did a full seating evaluation, recommended a different style seat. Now she has the support she needs to stay upright, to better balance her head, and she can much more readily access her device using direct access. I'm going to go back one more time here, sorry. It's also important to look at positioning the device. If the device is not somewhere where the client can readily access it, that's going to be a problem. Now, with switch scanning, the position of the device isn't nearly as critical, but for direct select, we need that client to have the device in a spot where they can reach the entire surface of the display, ideally. Here in the first picture, Allie did not have a mount, so her device was on whatever work surface was around. So she had to be near a table or a desk in order to use her device, and she couldn't quite get close enough, and her device was flat. It was flat to the table surface. You can see on the right that now she has a mount holding it onto her chair, so she can use it whenever she wants, which is great. But we were also able to choose the appropriate distance between her and her device for her method of access, and we were able to choose an angle that optimized her vision and her direct access as well. There are other facilitators we could use to help someone be as successful as possible to optimize that motor task of direct access. These include pointers, key guards, and programming. Splinting can do two different things. First, it can align the wrist for the client so that the force goes where it needs to go. A lot of our clients have very flexed wrist because of a lack of range of motion. And when that client with that very, very flexed wrist tries to reach out with a finger and touch an area of their display, the force tends to be moving forward from that hand rather than down through the finger, and it's because of the angle of the wrist. It's hard for the client to get adequate activation pressure, where if we extend the wrist and hold it in a more functional alignment in terms of flexion and extension, but also side to side, any ulnar or radial deviations, we can keep that wrist in a neutral alignment, then the finger can exert the force where it needs to go. Another advantage of splinting for some of our clients is finger isolation. There's a variety of splints on the market. I've sometimes just jerry-rigged something to see if it would work for my clients to help them keep that finger extended even though the rest of the hand may tend to fist, particularly with clients who have increased tone. So sometimes a way I can just simulate this is on this middle knuckle here, the PIP, I will take a Band-Aid, take the pad part of the Band-Aid that usually goes over that owie, and make sure it's right here on that crease so that it's hard for the client to bend their finger. And that gives me a sense of, will this help without actually having to buy a splint? I've even been known to use a little couple popsicle sticks and some medical tape or Band-Aids if you have to, just to simulate if I hold this finger straight, does it help my client with their direct access? And if it does, then we try to come up with a more permanent solution. There are a variety of pointers out there. So if a client has difficulty isolating a finger or a thumb, a pointer may be something the client can use instead to accurately make selections. There are pointers that are just held in the hand. Your client may be able to do that. One of the challenges with handheld pointers is the client needs to put it down at some point and may not be able to retrieve it independently or might drop it when they don't want to. There are others that are mounted to some sort of splint, either a universal cuff like is shown here on the right side, or a actual therapy-generated splint that is adapted to hold some type of pointer. This allows a client who can't otherwise isolate a finger or exert enough force to accurately activate a location, but the pointer can act that way for the client. It can fill that function. One of the challenges when we're using something like this is that it's hard to see the target sometimes because the hand is covering a lot of the keyboard in this situation, but communication device display. So these can be helpful, but there are some considerations there to make sure it's really going to work well for the client. There are some pointers that are mounted at the chin, like the one pictured here, or off of the head, where this pointer will come more off the forehead area. And there are mouth sticks as well. Now, head pointers and chin pointers are not used very often anymore. Certainly, it's not the most flattering look. These are a very old, dated application. It still works for some clients. One of the difficulties some of my clients have when they try to use something like this is stabilization. So if my client moves their head forward, lands on their desired target, it can be difficult to release because that takes a lot of internal, intrinsic stability for the client, or they have to find it from their positioning system. If they are just out there in space, the client might have difficulty lifting off of the surface because they're somewhat bearing weight on that surface. If the client is using a tablet or smartphone-based communication application, then the pointer must have a specialized end to activate the device. There are a number of these pointers around, and they could be conceivably mounted in a splint as well. There are some mouth sticks that are available with this conductive end as well. Key guards are available for most speech-generating devices that are available on the market. These provide stability, promote finger and thumb isolation, and sometimes can be helpful, sometimes not for vision. So the idea here is typically we have just an open display, and it's essential that the client can isolate a finger or a thumb to make a selection and that the rest of their hand doesn't accidentally brush the screen. How a key guard works is that the client can rest their entire hand on top of the surface of the key guard, which rests above the level of the display. They can then slide their hand to the desired location and push a finger or thumb through. So this can help the client with finger or thumb isolation, and it provides stability because my whole hand is resting on the surface of the display. This can slow some people down though, so it's important to look at overall efficiency. And depending on the key guard, vision can be challenging. I find that for some of my clients, if the key guard is a solid color, it might make it actually easier to discriminate all these various teeny locations on the communication device display. If it's clear, especially if it's rather thick, sometimes as the client is visually scanning their choices, there can be a little visual distortion through the areas covered by that clear key guard, and that can actually make the visual requirements a little higher for using a speech-generating device. We then have programming. Now this varies, of course, from device to device, but here are some of the particular options that are available on some of them. First, we can choose whether or not to have activation on contact or release. Typically, it's on contact. I reach out with a finger, I touch a selection, and voila, it's activated. I've just spoken my selection. On release, I have to let go of that selection before it speaks. Why would we do that? Well, some clients might need to stabilize against the device, slide their hand across the display in order to get to a location, and then release. If the client does that and we have this device programmed for activation on contact, they've just selected 20 things. If we have it programmed for activation on release, the client can slide across the device, isolate their finger or thumb on their desired selection, and then carefully release. And that can help accuracy for some clients. We also can change the activation acceptance time on most of these devices. That also allows the client to move across the display without activating everything, and they have to remain on their desired selection for a programmable amount of time for it to be accepted. That allows the person, again, to slide across as long as they do it quickly, remain for a second on their desired selection, and then boom, it's selected after that time elapses. Now this can slow someone down a little bit depending on how much time they need, and that's important to keep in mind when they're putting together a sentence like, I like to go to plays. There's audio feedback available on some of these devices as well, so when the client makes a selection, they'll hear a click, kind of like we hear a click on a standard computer keyboard. This can be important because let's say it's a client who is putting together a sentence like Eric was doing. He doesn't hear the feedback right away until he chooses to speak the entire display. So it provides just a little extra feedback to let the client know, yes, I did activate that location. Choices tend to be different on tablet-based devices, so you just have to see what your programming options are on that tablet, on the operating system of that tablet, and on the communication app that you are using. There's some things we can do with programming to optimize vision for a client. We can change the size of the location so that it's easier for a client to see. The challenge with that is if we make the sizes really big, the client has less available vocabulary. They're going to have to perhaps change screens more often, and that can make it more difficult to hunt down my vocabulary. I can also change colors and contrast. So oftentimes I can choose the color of the actual location of my vocabulary. I can also change the background color of that particular square and then the background of the entire screen. So right now this background is white, and I have various color backgrounds for each of my icons. This allows for some coding as well. So here, verbs appear to be highlighted in green, or not really truly highlighted, but the background is in green, and that helps the client. Speaking of highlight, when the client makes a selection, sometimes a highlight appears almost similar to this green outline here on yes. That can provide some additional feedback as well. So how do we know whether to move on to a new access method? Well, if the client from a motor standpoint simply can't reach all the areas of the display, or if the client's motor skills are limiting their vocabulary choices. So let's say this client using this Tech Talk, which has 8 selections on it, has dozens of things to say. Well, they're kind of out of luck. They have 8 locations. We don't want to limit someone's vocabulary either because they can't see something smaller or because they can't access something smaller. Again, many devices will continue to change what's on the display. They have a dynamic display. But if a client has to go through page after page after page to find their vocabulary, if we find vocabulary is limited due to motor skills, it may be time to explore other access methods. Again, same situation with vision. If the client can't see the display well enough to locate and select their vocabulary, if their vision is limiting their vocabulary choices, then they may need a different access method. And usually that's going to be scanning, because switch scanning allows for auditory scanning. So the client that's having difficulty seeing their selections or discriminating their selections from those selections around it can hear their choices instead. And between the visual and auditory feedback they get, be successful with communication use. So important to keep this in mind. I do see occasionally clients who absolutely have enough motor control to use direct access, but they simply don't have enough vision. And that can be acuity, it can be visual perceptual skills, it can be cortical visual impairment. But those visual issues are limiting their ability to use direct access. Okay, I want to take a break here and see if we have any questions before we move on to a few case studies. So feel free to type in those questions. or comments, whatever you would like, and I will give folks just a minute to do that. All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now. You might be typing ferociously right now, so please continue to do so. I'm going to move on to our case study, and if I see your question in there, I will stop and answer that. We'll also have time at the end for questions. All right, so this is Allie. Allie is in her early 20s. She has cerebral palsy and in her past had very, very severe seizure activity. Because of that, her doctors performed a hemispherectomy where half of her brain was removed, and that was the half that was responsible for the seizure activity. So her seizures are now under control, but as a result, she has hemiplegia on the opposite side of her body. She uses direct access, but when I was unable to sorry, I see a question there. I will grab that in just a second. She's using direct access, but not using it very well. So I ended up seeing Allie to try to determine what we could do to either improve her direct access or to determine if another access method was required. So we had issues that we needed to look at in terms of positioning, motivation, and understanding. So as we saw in previous pictures of Allie, she was hanging on her anterior trunk support. The contours of her seating system were not matching her contours. She had some asymmetries of her spine and rib cage. So a new seating system was recommended. It happened to be a molded seating system from Aspen Seating Ride Designs. It's called the Aspen Seating Orthosis. In her new seating system, she could now sit upright. She had improved visual regard of her device. Instead of hanging forward with her head hanging towards her lap, she could now gaze quite readily at this device and maintain upright and maintain balance of her head. She had improved proximal stability, so close into her body, she was very stable. That allowed her to free up her arms and reach out and access the device. If we're not positioned well, if we're not stable, it's hard to disassociate our extremities. What does that mean? That means that I can't free up my arms to reach out for something because they're too busy clamping to the sides of my body to keep me upright. Imagine if you were balanced on a big old ball. You were sitting on this ball, and you were trying to use your hands for a fine motor activity. It would be hard to get those hands out away from your body and do something in a refined manner because you're using your whole body just to hang on and not fall off this ball. If our clients are positioned well, that's what in essence happens to them. So by giving her the stability, she had better function in her arms to use this device. Motivation was a big deal for Allie too. As I mentioned before, a lot of her vocabulary choices that were currently on her device were not at all meaningful to her. She just didn't relate to them, and the device became something that she had to use in therapy. So we had to come up with some vocabulary that she was interested in, and it was all about social. So we added a new page with lots of social conversation. She was much more motivated to use that, and that allowed us to build on her vocabulary from there. Another great benefit of that is once she had some appropriate social conversation, some of her maladaptive behaviors tended to fade away as she was starting to be able to communicate in an appropriate manner. So that was also very helpful. Understanding was also an issue for Allie. Allie did not fully understand that this was a communication tool rather than just a task people were making her do. And it was very important that she understood that when she communicated, she could get what she wanted, a response. She could either direct her care or just have those social conversations. But that meant that for especially an initial period of time, she required very responsive communication partners. Allie had a long time where people would not always respond consistently or quickly to what she communicated. So she did what a lot of us do. She stopped bothering. So if she said something to a communication partner and that communication partner did not respond, she just didn't bother talking to them again. It took a long time since she was in her early 20s to combat that passivity and to convince her that this was worth her while. So we set up a number of appointments, and boy, if Allie said something, boy, did we respond. We responded quite overboard, but just to really, really encourage her that she could communicate and get a response. With my OT hat on, I was very excited for her to also be able to direct her care. She was able to let people know she wanted to tilt, for example, or sit back up, or she needed to be changed, or she was hungry or thirsty. And she became quite motivated by that vocabulary as well. All right, let's go back to questions here. We have a question here about vocal access for technologies, of course, other than a communication device. There certainly are a number of technologies that can be controlled by voice. It is beyond the scope of this webinar here today, but there are quite a few technologies that can be controlled by voice, particularly control of the environment. There's some voice-activated electronic aids to daily living and some nice voice-activated consumer technologies such as Alexa that are out there, Siri, that we can use to provide that voice control. All right, let's go to our second case study, and that is Miss Emma. Emma, at the time of this case study, was in elementary school. She has a rather rare progressive muscle disease that presents quite a bit like ALS, except that she's quite young. She was not accessing her device to her full potential, and we knew we were dealing with a progressive condition. So we needed to address her current access, but also try our best to find a means of her accessing both her power wheelchair and her communication device that would last as long as possible. So the device was placed at a distance from Emma when I first saw her and at an angle. You can see here that she has to reach quite a ways out. It's on a work surface, and she does not have it mounted at this point. She did not have good control at that angle, mostly because her arm didn't have adequate support. She has muscle weakness, and to access the device at this angle required her to hold her arm out in space. You can see that I have my hand on her shoulder. She had a lot of shoulder subluxation, very, very weak shoulder, and I was stabilizing the head of the humerus basically to allow her to show me what she could possibly do with the device at that position. So we repositioned the device, and this allowed her to rest her arm on the support of the arm pad. We did recommend some additional support as well. And she could move her hand over the device well with a key guard. So once this was repositioned, her accuracy improved, and this is really key, her effort was decreased. She had stability from the arm support, and that allowed her to simply use her wrist and fingers for access. And of course, she pivoted back and forth, but her entire forearm was receiving the support that she needed. But access was becoming more difficult because of this progressing muscle weakness. And she was also developing these rather unusual extraneous movements, certainly not common with a condition like ALS, but it was a feature of her rare condition. She didn't have the range of motion at this point to reach both her joystick on her power chair, which someone has swung out of the way here, and reach her communication device. So we needed to decide what to do. So we thought that if she could use her wheelchair joystick to control both the power chair and an interfaced communication device, that she wouldn't require as much range. She'd pretty much just have to hang out at the joystick. So here we picked a standalone joystick mouse, and we plugged it into her communication device to give us an idea of whether the joystick on a wheelchair could work with this device. The reason we used this is it was readily available. I happen to have it in my trunk, and it was not, we didn't have the interfacing components that were required for this wheelchair to allow us to simulate use through this particular joystick. We would have required an interfacing component and special interfacing cables. So although Emma could still use direct access, it was becoming more difficult due to progressive muscle weakness, and it was hard for her to reach both the communication device and the joystick. So we were able to emulate interfacing with the joystick mouse, and she did very well. She was able to control her communication device with this, and we eventually interfaced the communication device through the power chair. Emma is still able to drive and use her communication device both through the joystick. So could she use direct access? Yes, but it was becoming more difficult, and we needed to respect the fact that she needed to talk and drive, and she simply didn't have the active range of motion due to her muscle weakness to do both. By switching her to a different access method, she was able to be successful with both. And when she was in her manual chair and didn't have the power wheelchair joystick, she used this standalone joystick mouse to provide that control. All right, any questions about Emma or other questions at this point? All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I'm going to keep moving, but if you are typing, please keep typing. Our next case study is Lauren. Lauren is now an adult. She has cerebral palsy. When she was in her early teen years, she used direct access, so she could reach out and touch her device in approximately the same placement that you see here. But during those teen years, we find that things often change, particularly with people with a condition like cerebral palsy. There's often growth spurts, and those growth spurts can impact curvatures of the spine and lead to other range losses. Her biomechanics changed as she got taller and as orthopedic consequences started occurring. As a result, she started getting upper back pain if she used direct access. So whenever she reached out to use her talker, she could for a while, but after talking for about an hour or two, she uses her device extensively during the day, she was developing these spasms in her upper back, and it was very uncomfortable for her. She also was not very efficient, and her efficiency was decreasing as she got older. It was just too slow and taking a large amount of effort. So we tried to switch by the left side of her head, and she did very well, but she didn't like how slow it was. Lauren had never scanned before, so she hit the switch and waited and waited and waited, and it feels so slow. So she was very frustrated and wasn't sure if she wanted to switch over to the switch. So we ended up doing a timed comparison. We asked her to put together a sentence of our choice and asked her to access that first directly and then through the switch. And even though she had only just tried the switch, it actually took about the same amount of time. But scanning was more efficient because it took less effort and she was more accurate. She was spending a large amount of time with her direct access going back and correcting her mistakes because she would accidentally activate something in the next location. So for a few years, she would use direct access in the morning, and then she changed to switch access when her back started hurting, and her accuracy would, as a result, go down. So that kept her fairly efficient throughout her day. As she continued to get older and move into her adult years, she found that it was easier for her to only use switch access. So even if our clients do not have a progressive condition, sometimes just due to aging, medical complications, progression of a non-progressive condition such as cerebral palsy, where we can still see changes, we may find that a change of access is required as well. And again, any questions or comments, feel free to pop those in. I like to give plenty of opportunity for questions. This is a group that I usually run out of time with answering questions, and of course we have quiet day today. That is okay. So I hope everyone's awake. Shake it up, stand up for a second, stretch, do what you need to do, and we will move into our next case study and our last one. This is Eric. We saw a video of Eric earlier attempting to use direct access, but it was very difficult for him. He has cerebral palsy, and his direct access is rather inefficient. It takes too much time and too much effort. Again, we saw this video earlier, so I'm not going to play it again. Each time he reached out for a location, his tone would quickly pull his arm back. He'd have an increase in tone. He also drove with a joystick, and if the joystick was swung out of the way where he could get up close to a table, it tended, as it is in this picture actually, it's swung back right now, his elbow often hit it during his direct access of his communication device. So can he use direct access? Yes, but it's inefficient. Too much time, too much effort. We saw that in the video before. So we tried a joystick mouse with Eric here, and he drove with good control. We are hoping that maybe he could use a communication device with good control. He needed to stabilize. When Eric attempted to access his communication device directly, and he would reach out and touch a location, his tone would pull him back. It was taking a lot of movement. But if he could grab onto something and stabilize, it kept him in one spot. It reduced the amount of movement required, and that increased his efficiency. By using the joystick mouse, he could hang on to that joystick handle, and that allowed him to stabilize by pulling against that handle. So he did very well, and we ended up interfacing his communication device with his power wheelchair using that joystick. Now, it's kind of funny we have these two case studies like this because in all of my career of 30 years now, I have really only done this a very few times, just a handful of times, and Emma and Eric are two of those times. They both happen to do very well with using this joystick to control their communication device as well as driving, but for different reasons. Emma didn't have the active range of motion due to muscle weakness to reach both her communication device and her joystick. And as she had a progressive condition, although she could directly access her communication device, we knew that that would become more and more difficult for her. It already was. With Eric, his tone was pulling him back every time he was reaching out to touch his device, and that was creating a lot of inefficiency. Now, I want to give you a word of caution. Using a joystick to control a communication device is very different than using it to drive. So when I'm driving around, let's say, a room, the movements required on that joystick are much larger than the amount of movements to, say, scan through 64 different communication selections. So I need more refined control to use a joystick with a communication device than I do for driving. So it's very important to try this out with both of those technologies, the power chair and the communication device. All right, here we go. And Deb, thanks for the help with the video there.
Now, do you want to tell Michele something about yourself that's pre-programmed? Or you can spell whatever you want. I didn't mean to give you such a hard time.
So here we have a standalone joystick.
So we're going to have to work on what we call rate enhancement, speeding up.
You can see his pattern where he pulls
Erica, I mean, that was beautiful. It just is fatiguing.
Was that table?
It's on there.
I'm trying to figure out a good spot, because I had it higher before. That looked like it was easier for you, huh? Okay, so this is a good spot?
So now we're just trying a USB joystick. We tried this for the first time 10 minutes ago. It's really nice, Sharon, because already he's not even looking at his hands. He was just looking at the Dynavox. Do you know what I mean?
I think
Yeah. But I mean, but do you see? Yeah.
he lost the mouse off the screen. That's what we want to talk to Dynavox about, to see how we can find where the cursor is. There it is, okay. I'll try to hide it somewhere where you won't get into trouble. Okay.
With mouse access on some of the devices, especially the past, the cursor sometimes will go off the screen, and then it's hard to find it again. And that was happening with Eric.
If you use something pre-stored, it'd be way easier. This is just nosy speech therapist. Are you using word power?
He's concentrating.
See, if you could just kick me now, Erica. Make that sweat flow.
So he's showing us really good eye-hand coordination. He's watching that highlight or cursor while he's moving his hand. That's pretty hard when you have cerebral palsy. And he's keeping his hand on the joystick instead of all that pulling back. That's allowing him to be more stable, faster, and more accurate.
You're really good at this. It's not showing up in prediction because the first letter is wrong, but I know what you're doing, so you're fine.
And I like how you're looking at the prediction. You know what word prediction? You know what word prediction is?
So he's also trying to word prediction here.
Hey, Joe, maybe come around behind him so, I don't know.
All right, that's the end of that one. And then I just want to show you a little brief part of this next video where you can see the screen. So you can see what it looks like while Eric is using this joystick mouse.
Nice control, Eric.
And the joystick isn't nailed down as much as it will be.
I'm just mentioning there that I'm trying my best to hold the
And this
joystick
is the
still.
main
It would
screen
be
on
much easier to assess if it was really mounted securely. It is not at this point. And in this video, he ends up telling us that his favorite play to watch is The Phantom of the Opera. So with Eric,
Look at you even correcting yourself.
and with Emma, the joystick ended up being a better decision for each of them. It ended up being more efficient, but for different reasons. For Lauren, she was able to
Think of another way of
use
saying it?
direct access in combination with switch access for a period of time, eventually changing switch access as she got older and continued to change. And with Allie, she did just fine with direct access once the device was mounted correctly for her. Even with Emma, her direct access was certainly better once we repositioned the device and provided her the support she needed on her forearm. Okay, So I want to open it up for questions here again towards the end of our webinar here. We have one question now. If you are having issues with motivation, are there any tools you use to help with finding out what that motivation is? Well, generally what I do is I ask the client if they're able to let me know. I ask their caregivers or their team members, what does this person like to do? And that can help me come up with some activities and ideas of how we can get someone started. From there, yeah, I think a lot of it is just using your intuition with this person, depending on their age, their developmental level, looking around if you're in their home or their room to see what sort of things they might like. One little girl I worked with, Mackenzie, was really having a hard time buying into a communication device, but she loved Toy Story, and she had a Buzz Lightyear toy that she was a big fan of. So we programmed the communication device to send infrared signals to Buzz Lightyear for her to control him. She could make him go and spin and dance and sing. And we filled a page of her communication device, or the one we are evaluating her with vocabulary to control Buzz Lightyear. She decided that was fun. We then used that to our advantage and slowly started increasing her vocabulary. So instead of only controlling Buzz, she could say things like, I like Toy Story, do you? My favorite character is Buzz Lightyear. Who's your favorite character? I have a Buzz Lightyear toy. I like to play with him. Do you want to watch? And before you knew it, within a few months, she had dozens and dozens of things to say, and we were able to transition her into other vocabulary. So it's finding the motivation for that individual, and that can just take a little bit of work. All right, while I'm waiting for other questions, I want to make sure I thank everyone for your time today. I know everyone's really limited on time, and I appreciate it. And I want to let you know about some upcoming webinars. In mid-July, we're going to talk about students who might be struggling with eye gaze and some strategies to help with that. In August, we're going to talk about if a client needs to use a switch, where we can put that switch, how we determine where to put the switch. And then finally in September, how to determine what type of switch the client can use. So I hope those are webinars you can join us for. I want to make sure you have my contact information. If you need to get a hold of me or want to look at any resources on my website, feel free to do that as well. So I'll just leave that up. And again, if people have questions or comments, this is the time. You can really ask anything you would like. For those of you who might be listening to this as a recorded webinar after our live offering, as I know a lot of people do, if you have questions or comments, feel free to reach out to my email as well. And thank you for your kind comments, Bridget. And Renee as well, thank you. And Denise, you guys are very kind. And Tamiko is suggesting that maybe there weren't a lot of questions this time because I was so thorough. I can only hope, but thank you. It's always difficult to problem solve out these situations, and of course every client is very unique. All right, well, we're about at the top of the hour, so if we don't have any more questions, I think we will go ahead and end this webinar for today. Again, thank you very much for your time and your interest, and I hope that you can join us on a future AbleNet webinar.